Chapter 3 Law on Obligations and Contracts. The learning objectives. First, identify the different kinds of obligation and contracts. Second, enumerate the ways of extinguishing an obligation. Third, enumerate possible applications of contracts in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry. The person desiring to engage in a business in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry will meet certain obligations. Agreements arising from contracts will have to be made, and potential breach from these agreements will be encountered. Therefore, there is a need to study the fundamental principle involving obligations and contracts. Obligation. In Article 1156, an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. Generally, a person who has an obligation arising from whatever sources should comply with its corresponding requirements, considering the damage it may produce to one of the contracting parties or even to a third person. Non-compliance of what is demanded by the obligation may give the aggrieved party different course of action, such as demand for payment and damages. So, there are three kinds of obligation under the law. First, the obligation to give. The debtor is obliged to deliver the movable or immovable things to the creditor. Example, obligation to deliver the thing in sale, deposit, pledge, and donation. Second, to do. All kinds of work or services, whether physical or mental, is covered. For example, contract for event organizing, professional services like painting, modeling, and singing. Then third, not to do, means remaining from doing some acts like obligation of a building proprietor to refrain from committing nuisance through noise, offensive odor, smoke, heat, and etc. The elements of obligation. An obligation is a legal duty, however created, the violation of which may become the basis of an action. Every obligation has four definite elements, without which no obligation can exist. First is the active subject. It is one who is demanding the performance of the obligation. It is he who is in his favor the obligation is constituted, establishment, or created. Then second is the passive subject, the one bound to perform the presentation, to give, to do, or not to do. He is called the debtor or obligor. Then third, the prestation or object. It is the subject matter of the obligation which has an economic value or susceptible of pecuniary substitution in case of non-compliance. Then fourth is the efficient cause. It is the juridical tie or vinculum by virtue of which the debtor has become bound to perform the prestation. The vinculum juris is also known as juridicor legal tie. Kinds of obligation as to judicial enforceability. Obligation may be classified according to judicial enforceability. First is the civil obligation. This is an obligation which is not fulfilled when it comes due and demandable, may be enforced in court through action. Then second, the natural obligation. This is a special kind of obligation which cannot be reinforced in court but which authorizes the retention of the voluntary payment or performance made by the debtor. Then lastly, the moral obligation. It arises not from the positive law but from the moral law developed by the church and not enforceable by the court. So let us also discuss the contract. Contract defined, it is the meeting of the minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the others to give something or to render some service. So here are the essential elements of a contract. The following are the essential elements of a contract. First is the consent, second is the objective concern, and third is the cause. So we discussed the consent. So consent signifies the meeting of the offer and the acceptance upon the thing and the cause which are to constitute the contract. It comprises the following elements: A. Concurrence of the offer and the acceptance. B. Contracting parties must possess the necessary legal capacity. And lastly, consent must be intelligent, free, spontaneous, and real. Then second, the objective concern. It could be any of the following: a thing, right, or service. The objective certain must have the following requisites. First, object should be within the commerce of men. Second, it should be real or possible. It should exist at the moment of the celebration of contract, or at least it can exist subsequently or in the future. Then third, object should be licit or not be a contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. Then lastly, it should be determinate or at least possible of determination as to its kind. Then the last one is the cause. It is why of the contract or the essential reason which moves the contracting parties to enter into the contract. It must have the following requisite. First, should be in existence. Second, should be licit or lawful. And third, should be true. So here are the perfection of contract. In general, contracts are perfected from the moment that there is manifestation of the concurrence between the offer and the acceptance with respect to the object and the cause which shall constitute the contract. Then, the contract stages. First is the generation. It is the preliminary stage or process for the formation of the contract. It includes the bargaining of the subject of obligation and the consideration. Second, perfection of the birth of the contract. Then lastly, the consummation. It is the fulfillment of the purpose for which the contract was constituted. Then the characteristic of contract. Contract may be characterized as follows: obligatory, autonomy, mutuality, and relativity. First is the obligatory force. Once the contract is perfected, it shall be obligatory force upon both of the contracting parties. Then second, autonomy of the contract. Contracting parties are free to enter into a contract and to establish such stipulation, clauses, terms, and conditions as they may be deemed convenient. Then the third one is the mutuality of the contracts. The contract must bind both parties. Then lastly, relativity of the contract. Contract takes effect only between the parties, their assigns, and their hires. In the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry, contracts are used to extensively to formalize agreements between various parties, including customer bookings for accommodation and tours, travel agent services, transportation arrangements, vendor agreements for supplies, employment contract for staff, rental agreements for property, liability waivers, and insurance policies, essentially ensuring clarity regarding services provided, pricing, responsibility, and potential liabilities for both the customer and the service provider. So here are the specific application of contract in the tourism industry. Accommodation bookings. Example, hotel reservation, contract outlining room type, dates, rates, cancellation policy, and guest responsibilities. The vacation rentals. Agreements detail rental period, deposit requirements, property rules, and guest access. Then the tour operator services, package tour. Detailed contract outlining itinerary, inclusion, example, the accommodation, meals, activities, the pricing, and cancellation terms. Then the transportation arrangements, the airline tickets, for example, contract outlining flight details, baggage allowance, refund policies, and passenger rights. Then also the car rentals, agreements regarding rental period, insurance coverage, mileage limitation, and pick up and drop off locations. Lastly, we also discuss the key points to remember about contract and tourism industry. Tourism and hospitality industry. First is the clarity and specificity. Contract should clearly define all terms and conditions to avoid misunderstanding and disputes. Second is the compliance with laws. Contract must adhere to relevant consumer protection laws and regulation in the operating jurisdictions. Then lastly, the legal review. Consulting with legal professionals to ensure contracts are legally sound and properly drafted is crucial.